Marcus, are you okay with time, please?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome, thanks.
What you need to know about Scouts is that the founder, so Robert Baden-Powell, set up Scouts as a form of a military training activity where young boys could learn outdoor skills and things which would help them integrate into a military, to require them to be hugely nationalistic and have a love for their country, which we think is irrational and anachronistic for Scouts today. Let's start this debate with some setup. Firstly, I would posit the nationalistic elements of Scouts extend beyond the features that we see in the info slide. So it is things like saluting a flag, it is things like learning about national symbols or attending ceremonies like ANZAC Day in Australia. It also would be things like working towards certain badges that require you to do things that are highly nationalistic, or attending religious shrines and nationalistic religious elements of your country as well. Secondly, I would say at the point where you no longer do things like attend these ceremonies or engage in nationalistic attitudes, you still have a lot of time spent at Scouts, so it would be replaced with other activities. So things like learning about the general outdoors, or having a more international focus in Scouts, which is already something where there is a growing push towards within a scouting organisation today. Secondly, I would say this is obviously not an active debate. So if an opposition team were to run, this is good for Scouts as an organisation. They would need to demonstrate that is the act which we overwhelmingly care about in this debate before they could run it. And if that's unclear, happy to take a clarification, otherwise I'm going to go ahead with the arguments. Argument 1.1. I think this changes the makeup of Scouts for the better. We would posit at the moment, Scouts is a incredibly, has an incredibly low makeup of individuals who are ethnically or racially diverse because of the heavy nationalistic bent, which makes it very unlikely or less likely you're likely to enroll your child in Scouts. What are the reasons for this? Number one, I think that at the point Scouts is overwhelmingly nationalistic. You require a set of knowledge about a country's history or about national symbols before you can really feel a sense of belonging. When you're saluting a flag that you do not feel you belong to, makes you far less likely to want to become part of the scouting family. Secondly, we would say the religious elements of Scouts are incredibly alienating. If you're somebody who doesn't practice Christianity, and you're in Australia, where Scouts is an overwhelmingly Christian country because that is seen as a national religion, quote unquote, that is something which alienates individuals who are Sikh or Hindu, for example, from wanting to engage in that. You don't want to have to say a prayer towards the Christian God before you eat, if that is not the God that you worship. Thirdly, we would say that you have to do things like attend certain nationalistic ceremonies is very alienating. Either, for example, you're attending like a military ceremony as somebody who has like the background of somebody that the ANZACs fought against and killed, or alternatively, you just don't feel any sense of connection. You don't have Australian heritage, for example. You don't feel a connection towards the ANZACs per se. Fourthly, I would say, even if you think these are a bit speculative, they aren't speculative in the minds of parents who are the ones enrolling their children into the organisation. All of the branding of Scouts is in Australia, green and gold, Australian flag branded. It's incredibly nationalistic and it's very obvious from the outset. All of those stop you from wanting to enroll your kids, which has a set of impacts on, the makeup of Scouts as an organisation, which is, it is an incredibly large organisation, which is not very racially or ethnically diverse, and the few people who do come from underrepresented backgrounds will feel isolated, will not feel like they can belong, and the benefits of Scouts, of learning about outdoor skills, getting team building, for example, are kept in the hands of very few individuals. We think that is bad. Happy to take the point from closing.
Yeah. Do you think it's likely that if they remove all this nationalistic stuff, that you are going to get a huge influx of, for example, new immigrant families and like Sikhs and Muslims into the organisation anyway?
Yeah, they will, because over time, so I would analogize this to, for example, corporations, for example, were often seen as like boys' clubs for a long time, that had a big push towards diversifying, and that increased the influx of women that went into like tech, for example. I think it would be very similar. There would be a time frame when we'll end up in this organisation. Secondly, as a principle, nationalism is something we ought minimize regardless of the organisation. Why is nationalism bad? Number one, because you do not choose the country in which you come from, so it is foolish to be proud of it. The country in which you were born is incredibly arbitrary. It is not something you have chosen or something which you have put thought into. For that reason, it is not something which you should overwhelmingly celebrate. Secondly, we would say nationalism otherizes individuals. That is to say, you're prioritizing your own country, the place in which you live, and the geographic location in which you are in. And that is something which makes you celebrate overwhelmingly factors about your location at the expense of other locations which you aren't putting as much emphasis on. When you were saying our country is uniquely good, the corollary of that is that other countries are uniquely not as good in that way, and that otherizes people. Thirdly, I would say it often makes you do things which are in service of your country, rather than using your own moral compass to guide you. It's the reason why nationalism is so important in, say, a military context, because you're required to have an overwhelmingly loyal outlook towards the military, so you will kill for your nation, which may be something which is against your own moral compass. Fourthly, I'd say this as a kind of like flow-on harm of that. It gives the state a high level of control over your behaviour. Do you believe the state is overwhelmingly good? Fifthly though, I think it puts a focus on what you have with other people within your own country, as opposed to a focus on the shared human identity. So people are very willing to do things like donate towards like Red Cross providing blood in Australia, but unlikely to do things like provide money towards amnesty, helping people in a country that is very far away. Notably though, we think Scouts applies nationalism in a bad way. Number one, Scouts is run by volunteers. It is not run by formally trained individuals. It's run by like the parents of people that kind of like their kids are in Scouts, and they don't have formal training on how to like do this properly. They're going in and teaching their kids that like Captain Cook came to Australia and colonized the country in a way which was like good for the indigenous population. That is not good nationalism. We think is overwhelmingly likely to be bad. Thirdly, in this speech though, we think the nationalistic elements of Scouts are the worst parts of Scouts, and we would rather other things take that place. Firstly, I would say it's kind of like boring, like learning about Australian history, for example. You could be doing things like learning how to tie a knot, going outdoors, having athletic activities, doing things which are team building. Truly boring. Secondly, I think often the alternatives that I've just listed out often far better for you, given there is an opportunity cost where you're going through things like an ANZAC Day ceremony or going through like a religious shrine where you could be doing other activities. And given Scouts is an organisation with millions of individuals in it, this is a benefit or a harm, I guess, which applies on a massive scale, which we can claim uniquely on slide opening government. At the end of this point and at the end of this speech, what are we giving you? Number one, a clear conception of what Scouts is and why it applies nationalism in an incredibly harmful way. Secondly, reasons why Scouts becomes more inclusive and tolerant on our side of the debate. And thirdly, reasons why these are activities which are uniquely bad for the development of kids in Scouts. Couldn't be proud of you folks.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'd like to welcome the Leader of the Opposition.
Incorporation of nationalistic elements within the Scouts program is a unique way for it to situate itself within the long lineage of this nation's identity, is a way for it to, I guess, situate itself and inform its practices. That's why it is so important. On setup though, what are these programs? Obviously they're charitable and community programs, meaning that they raise skills and interests, especially for younger demographics. Let's break down what this actually means. It is a charitable and community organisation, meaning it is specifically reliant on volunteer forces. The implications of this is that you care a lot about recruitment, know that a lot of people self-select in a way that aligns with this program, and know that there is a comparative where you can do alternative programs, you can volunteer with St. John, you can volunteer with all these other things. So it means that you have to have this unique identity, this unique selling point. But secondly, because it is reliant on volunteer forces, you have to cultivate like a baseline of skills that you can then be like, it can be used for productively. These people can be like a good labour force. Secondly, in terms of its organisation, it is hierarchical, meaning that there is a code of ethics that is enforced. They say that they want to just have rogue volunteers. Know that it is good to have volunteers who have like from different experiences, obviously, but also there is just like a good emphasis on discipline and on maintaining the code of ethics. Who are the types of people who self-select into Scouts in the status quo? We would know that these are often people who are just broadly interested in outdoor activities, in these survival activities, and they often care about these things. There's also this militaristic element. Obviously, there is a link to cadets, but the implication of this isn't that you just now start fighting for your country. It means that you can instill the good things that the military does instill, things like service to your community, things like a respect for authority. These are all, I guess, beneficial things for children and young people. But obviously, there is just this generational aspect. Obviously, if your parents have done Scouts, you are likely to just want to join. It's part of almost your family and your personal identity. The opposition says that the demographics will change if we remove this nationalistic bend. Firstly, it's not clear, like, to the extent at which nationalism is actually informative of like recruitment programs or just like how they their general comportment. But secondly, it's unclear to the extent at which it is alienating. Note that like it's not a direct harm. There's a lot of religious elements in just like America and Australia. You often just acclimatize to it, and it also just doesn't exist in every country to the extent that they want to claim. But also there are other just countervailing pressures that would incentivize people to opt in. Often your friends do it. Often you just care about the activities. You think it's a fun way to spend, or like it's a good hobby to have. Okay, now, firstly on why nationalism is a good thing, starting with why it is done well. On incentive analysis, for incentives. Firstly, as I hinted to in my setup, they are relying on just communal attitudes of the people who engage, and also just general wider sentiment, because this is how they get their volunteers. There is no financial incentive to join the Scouts, meaning there is firstly a heavy preference on community building, but also just like a general consideration of the wider community sentiments. Secondly, there are just opt-in mechanisms that mean that they have a self-selection for approachable practices. The most appetizing and like generalized and palatable forms of nationalism. It is not xenophobia. It is not othering to like other nations. Instead, it is literally just like pledging allegiance to the flag. Just having a general awareness of your nation's lineage. We think that this is pretty benign and actually beneficial. Thirdly, it is just comprised of predominantly younger demographics who have structural preferences for more progressive ideals that they obviously have incentives to cater towards. But fourthly, they just have had a revealed preference to liberalize and just, I guess, acclimate to the general common sentiments. I guess in response to the prominence of Girl Guides, it is now no longer just exclusively to boys. Obviously, they do change. It is not like ahistorical like they try and say. The impact of all of this is that there are structural incentives for them to engage in like a positive consideration of nationalism in a way that is, I guess, done well. Secondly, on capacity analysis, we would just say that they have like ideological engagement with nationalism, sure, and like militaristic bends, but often this is like quite performative, meaning that if it is performative, it is done in a way that isn't, I guess, like going to be othering. Instead, it is a signaling mechanism to the people within Scouts and to society broadly. But also they have the capacity to do this well because, as OGs concedes, they're often just volunteer young leaders who, like, their role is literally for everyone to have a good time. They do have common sense. They're not going to instill, like, I guess, xenophobic ideas. And so this all just points to it being benign, it being instead like a performative and signaling mechanism, which we think is very good. What are the benefits of this? But before I move on, I'll take Gallery.
Sure. He's a scoutmaster, likely to teach the nuances of Australian colonial history well, given they have no pedagogical training and are operating within the bounds of an incredibly nationalistic enterprise.
It's not like a history lesson where they literally go through the colonization of Australia. Instead, you learn how to tie a knot and then learn and find the historical link to how G.J. Jones used that knot. Like, G.I. Jones used that knot. Like, it's literally just instilling a general awareness of your culture and your nationalistic history and a general appreciation of this. You're not learning, like, you're not being taught the intricacies of history. Okay, what are these benefits that we point to? Firstly, obviously now you just instill an overwhelming amount of pride and understanding of your national history. We would contend that this is really good. Know that this is also part of the Scouts lineage, and it means that if you now feel intimately tied to this history, you can build confidence, you can build an awareness of your place within the broader society. Know this is the society that you have to live in, even if it was arbitrarily decided. Secondly, now you align with the common broader sentiments of the Scouts aligns with the broader sentiments that are often existing in most nations, know that in America, in schools, they pledge allegiance to the flag. Now you were just, I guess, situating yourself in alignment with the general, wider sentiments. Thirdly, it allows for, deviation from this would, I guess, run counter to the external perceptions of Scouts. We care for it to, adhere to how Scouts is perceived externally. You will not deviate from this. And ultimately, this just allows you to signal that you are part of a part of the wider nation. You do belong, and it is something super, super important for both the organisation and the students or the children in it. That's why we're passionate for this.
Thank the Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to welcome the Deputy Prime Minister.
Three pushes from open opposition that I'll deal with in this speech. The first seems to be an implicit claim that because this is an incredibly volunteering-based organisation, nationalism, for one reason or another, encourages individuals to join the organisation and stay on as volunteers to perpetuate the scouting org. The problem with this argument is that Arin already explains why we get a far greater diversity of individuals who are willing to join the Scouts at this point in time, which means that we get to set up generationally into the future a far greater recruitment pool for the set of individuals who are likely to volunteer to become future Scout leaders, etc. And we would identify that the most important discriminating factor for if or if not somebody becomes one of those leaders is not the fact that, they were treated particularly well or did feel a particularly close tie to country, which seems like an argument for them to do things like, engage in any of the other volunteering practices this team identifies. It is rather to feel like they had a good and inclusive and welcoming time in that scouting organisation, to feel like they want to perpetuate that experience to generations into the future. It is very unclear, and I think we clearly get a far more inclusive, welcoming, and larger scouting organisation under our side of the house. The second claim that is made is that it's actually unclear that this would be significantly alienating for the reason that people already have to do things like acclimatise to external and foreign religions or live in different and separate countries, and that there are countervailing norms of friendship. Well, we would point out that Scouts uniquely is an activity where a sense of feeling included is particularly important. Firstly, this is especially true when there is a nationalistic tilt to the activity, as Arin already explained to you. The fact that you feel alienated and feel like you can't understand what the activities are about, do not feel connected to the community activities that are being practiced, means that you just very fundamentally are unlikely to enjoy this experience. But we would also observe that the way Scouts occurs in small, tightly knit community centres, you kind of go out occasionally into isolated areas where the only people you have around you are from that community. That is an environment where the experience is, it's kind of make or break based on the people around you. We think that insofar as this is much less inclusive, that would just be a particularly terrible experience for these individuals. And yes, obviously people of color acclimatize to things like racism in, local communities. Obviously minority religion individuals acclimatize to their local areas. But that does not make the experience any less alienating. It doesn't mean that they're less frozen off from engaging in those activities, especially when this is an optional school extracurricular. If I could not have attended parts of my schooling experience, I probably would have done that. So I think it's actually really unclear why they get substantial amounts of buy-in in this debate. The second thing to explain, the final thing we get in this claim is just to say that maybe nationalism has some sort of benefits which are inherent to it that we ought to defend under a side opening opposition. The first thing is that Arin already explains why this is done badly. And we would point out that oftentimes it does actually involve fairly detailed retelling of things like history, either for the fact that there might be an explicit, cultural history badge which requires you to understand the, history of that country, but more commonly it might look like things like going to ceremonies like an ANZAC parade, where the history of that practice does need to be actively explained to you. They explain that maybe nationalism is done well by these individuals, or at least they'll try to, but that's where Arin's second contribution is directly responsive, because we explained to you that nationalism in all its forms is fundamentally alienating, fundamentally irrational, and bad. And the very simple way we would give here is that even if you believe what opening opposition has to say about why nationalism can bring benefits to you internally within a country, Arin Arin's impacts extend beyond that and deal with the impacts between countries. And there are a great many countries, but there are a far greater number of linkages between those countries, which means that each external harm is amplified against the benefits of nationalism multiple times. The final claim we would make here is that insofar as you believe what opening opposition tries to say, when they tell you that, well, this organization is liberalizing, it's moving away from its past, it's becoming better, it is just so unclear then why we would allow a remnant of the past to stay within the code rather than allowing the code to just change and adapt in much the same way that their team claims the organization has. It's very unclear why new Scoutmasters who might not have such a sense of the history might look at this code and internalize all of those older values, if, as opening opposition seems to principally concede, they are at a very fundamental level quite bad. Before I move on, I'll take closing.
Just ballpark it for me. What percentage of the time which kids spend in Scouts do you think is spent on extracurricular history lessons?
That actually leads me perfectly into this extension, because we would point out that the depth of cultural engagement in things like history and the military actually extends far further than what simply appears as things like national ceremony. So that's going to lead me onto this second form of extension, which is just to explain why this overwhelmingly is likely to encourage military participation. The first thing we would identify is that because this is an organization which is volunteer-run and is already under the status quo very closely tied to nationalism, it is literally the perfect recruiting ground for individuals who currently occupy things like military roles, who want to encourage the participation of these young children within the military. And that means that the status quo participants do often face relatively heavy things like indoctrination. And yes, that might look like things like, for example, history lessons or national ceremony, but it also looks more generally like things like getting guest speakers in to talk to the kids about what good community values are. And those speakers are often directly from the military and talk about things like national service, for example. It might look like things like advertising, when there's elements of parts of sponsorship or gear procurement for when the kids go out camping, for example. And yes, all of that is obviously kind of, seems pithy at first. The concentration and scale at which this practice occurs means that there is a meaningful influence towards the military, especially because Arin explained to you the historical context behind the foundation of this organization, which means that it's relatively closely tied in as a form of legacy. Why do we think that this is bad? The first thing we would observe is that military participation overwhelmingly is just not in the incentives of these young children. Obviously, it's an incredibly risky vocation. It's something where they are vulnerable to face a lot of harm. Secondly, we think military nationalism uniquely applies toxic narratives of nationalism, because the way you study your history is not just about your country internally, but also has to do with the narratives of conflicts your country engaged in against other countries, where your country in its nationalism is presented as being superior, is presented as being particularly better, obviously out of order, out of obviously activating all of the particular harms Arin explains to you. But the final thing we would say is that obviously the expansion of the military is bad in the general case. It often engages in the fighting and perpetuation of conflicts across the globe, something we obviously are not willing to stand for. And let's just be really comparative here, because yes, under our side, in a world where you are much more nation agnostic, and you require that in order for these organizations to be eligible for chartership, maybe neither organization has amazing enforcement, but our team uniquely gets a change in the cultural values, a shift in the ways in which these organizations are run, which we think fundamentally encourages a much more inclusive society, but also society. How to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister, the camera, and would like to welcome the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Given that Scouts is a structure which definitionally relies on the communal contribution and engagement of the people who volunteer, I just do not think that the pernicious characterization of nationalism as it apparently forms in just exists on the Prime Minister case in the form that it does. I just do not think this is a realistic characterization. I can't believe to point this out, that Scouts and Cadets, I think, are different things and probably can be understood as separate organizations with very different intentions and things like that. And the second thing I'll note in this introduction is that given that there are a set of structural factors, which means that the Scouts organization needs to cater towards a structurally progressive young generation in which its target audience is, in which there is a retrospective recognition of harmful aspects of nationalism in the majority of Western nations around the world, which is where Scouts predominantly caters in. And thirdly and finally, the existence of nationalism as a cultural foundation and identity requires the fact that Western nations and those who engage in nationalism and Western, Western countries and stuff like that engage in a way where they understand multiculturalism, understand the nuances of what nationalism is, understand both the harms and benefits of this. I think this case just does not actually try to deal with the fact that it's a debate about Scouts, not about nationalism. 3 or 4 things in this speech. Firstly, in clarifying Scouts as a body in comparative to the cadets that they try to straw man on. Secondly, on representation and national identity, directly engaging with this stuff about minority alienation. Thirdly, an explanation for why nationalism as a principal badge is a stupid argument. And finally, an argument about why nationalism can be good and is likely to be done well by cadets. Firstly, on Scouts. Firstly, the contribution I think that should just get us opening, in the win on the opening half is just to point out that Scouts and cadets have a very structurally different incentive. That is the fact that Scouts have an incentive to promote things like, outdoor education and, all of the things like, the POI is very good. I think you spend 90% of your time doing camping and hiking and tying knots. You spend maybe 10% of your time, engaging in national history and stuff like that. I don't think you spend any of your time engaging in weapons or militaristic propaganda or anything like that, which means that all of the harms that they try to point to insofar as there is an association between the historical nationalism and military of the Scouts probably does not exist. Even if it is some badges, I think this is not the pernicious way in which it manifests. Second contribution about representation and national identity. They try to tell you that ethnic and cultural minorities are alienated and therefore can be benefited at the point at which they are incorporated. We're just going to flip this and explain to you why Scouts is a unique mechanism through which those who are national and cultural minorities are actually able to engage and fit in with national identity and the changing multicultural landscape that is national identity around the world. The first thing I want to point out here is that the greatest barrier often met by those who come from immigrant families or cultural minority and things like that is the fact that they do not fit in, they just do not understand the cultural customs and practices and the national identity of countries. I think it is relatively common and understandable to see why ANZAC Day is a deeply irrational rational practice and things like that. But obviously, ANZAC Day is something that gives enormous amounts of pride, enormous amounts of identity and personal value to those who understand it. And the thing to explain here is that Scouts is a unique connecting mechanism which allows individuals to actually opt into these communities, to learn about these forms of national identity, to engage in things like Indigenous past and community and the environment and things like that. Firstly, the reason for this is just participation. You get to sign up in a place where it's very easy, where they engage in you, where there's a bonding mechanism or there's a bridging mechanism which allows you to be, ease into the nationalistic elements of your country and things like that. The second thing is to just understand that there is a community that exists in Scouts at the point at which allows you to acculturate into the, the national identity, things like that. That is probably a good thing. The second thing I want to point out here is nationalism is something that just exists, whether or not you allow the Scouts to engage in it. At the very least, the Scouts probably engages in it with a set of positive incentives, positive capacities, and engage in it in a positive way. Final thing to point out here is even if these things are deeply strange, they probably give a significant amount of value and probably give positive value to the people who are alienated and are subsequently, folded into the understandings of these things and stuff like that. Yeah, I'll take it now.
Yeah, how many Indigenous history classes are being taught by the Scouts?
Probably more than your percentage of gun-ho weapons that exist in Scouts. I think comparatively, the Scouts probably just learn more about the Indigenous practices and the engagement with the environment than the militaristic propaganda that you propose. I think on the comparative, we probably do far more Indigenous history than you do militaristic propaganda. Secondly, I'm going to explain why nationalism just is not a principle bad. Because notably, the arguments for principle justification for why nationalism is bad are just a set of very bad principle justifications and some pragmatic justifications. We have 3 things here. Firstly, on the fact that nationalism is arbitrary. This is just a bad principle. Just because things are arbitrary does not mean that they have moral insignificance or morally insignificant. Things like gender identity, things like personal preferences and their identity. The fact that I was born with certain, the Bosea extension, which is the fact that I was born with certain characteristics or born in certain countries or born with a family does not mean that those things are necessarily arbitrary. Just because it's arbitrary does not mean it's a moral harm, right? Secondly, the fact that nationalism is othering. I think there are lots of things in the world that are othering. We only see that form of othering as a harm at to point out that othering necessarily precludes individuals from engaging it positively. That is to say, when I have a political position that is othering, that is only harmful in so far as that political position causes active harm on the comparative. That is to say, if the political position or that form of identity is accepting of others, is multicultural in certain aspects, or allows you to engage in that community, that is probably something that is for the good, something that we all allow. The final, Hail Mary we have here is that nationalism in a lot of instances promotes killing and violence. I think this exists in certain subsets of nationalism and certain manifestations of nationalism, but for the three structural reasons that we give you, that is to say, you must engage in the youth generation, you must engage with cultural norms and mores, and the fact that you must engage in positive forms of these things, which means that you're unlikely to go to your scouts group and go we should kill all these people, or we should dispossess their land, or things like that. I just do not see why this is likely to happen. And finally, we flip this, because it is just likely a recognition of historical wrongs, and probably a recognition of where nationalism has made mistakes or things like that. Because of the people who volunteer, because of the types of people who actually volunteer in scouts and engage in scouts, probably done in a good way. Final thing to quickly explain is why nationalism can be good and is likely to be done good by scouts. The first thing I want to explain here is that because it's a cultural identity in a movement, you are privy to the things that change in society. And if society deems certain aspects of nationalism to be bad, that's probably going to be reflected in the way that scouts is run and how nationalism is engaged with in the scouts. The second thing to explain here is that because there is fundamentally structural oversight, at the very least you are able to guide the direction in which nationalism is. We can just use counterfeit and explain that they're going to do the best version of nationalism. That is probably something that we can do. The final thing is there is just communal accountability that exists when you go to scouts. That is to say, when you wear a uniform, there is a burden on you to go to the community and show that you're a positive force of charity. That is to say that if you do bad things or bad forms of nationalism, people are going to judge you. So obviously the scouts are going to do positive contributions to national identity and stuff like that. Really proud to oppose.
Thank you, Deputy Leader of the Opposition. I'd like to welcome the government member.
I'm going to do three things. Firstly, vertical extension, why engagement gets better, that actually means a quantitative increase in the amount of people in Scouts. Secondly, why this means that Scouts, without this nationalistic identity, are more likely to engage globally and help developing nations and other areas. And finally, why it helps individuals, the members inside the Scout groups. Okay, what does OG tell us on engagement? I think they tell us that it is just kind of sort of exclusionary, but not really, and that it is something that is perhaps shifting in the long term. I think this is problematic because the only reason in which they keep nationalistic identity is that, it lets people come in. But then they still explain all of this is for OO. But it still allows them to come in and get all the benefits from Scouts. So if we can explain that engagement is more, we claim all of those benefits, what do we tell you in addition of what OD explains? Firstly, to explain more so why nationalism is specifically tied to race. That is to say that nationalism is formed, happens in the formation of a country. That is when racism is prevalent, colonization is prevalent, and nationalism inherently requires an in-group and an out-group. That is why nationalism is specifically tied to race, and that is why it is specifically exclusionary in a way that O is incorrect in saying. But beyond that, I think there is a reason outside, even if you don't believe, let's just assume nationalism is benign. I think important thing to understand here is parents choose not to do it because they think that kids won't get a utility out of putting their kids into scouts. That is to say, what parent, especially if you don't have much money, your kids don't have your kids don't have much free time, they don't find a utility of giving your kids doing flag rising ceremonies or things about ANZAC. No, thank you. Parents will then even if they didn't care about nationalism, they just don't find the utility of doing it. And also kids themselves, there's a high attrition rate because they don't actually find any enjoyment. Note also, there's obviously younger generations don't have a nationalistic identity. They're obviously more globalized in the sense that people just have technology, they have friends in different countries. It's not clear why this was going to be, even if you were able to shift it, going to help. Sure.
Non-Indigenous people can still identify as Australian. Also, I think Scouts are free to join, I'm pretty sure.
But no, it's not about, sure, it's free, but it takes time. And that, when people don't have time, people have, it is actually something that is very important, right? It's a co-curricular activity that takes away time. People will not put their kids in, they will put their kids in tutoring, but they won't put their kids in Scouts. They'll put their kids in debating, which could be free at your school, but they won't put it in Scouts, because you only have a certain amount of time, right? And obviously, people who just perhaps have an altruistic or desire to have service, these people just not opt into Scouts because they don't derive the benefit from that. What is that to say at the end? That is to say that more people will engage, regardless if you thought there was a nationalistic identity, which we clearly say there is, people will just engage more in it. That means more people quantitatively in Scouts. This had a number of benefits. But moving on to what this happens for the global society and community integration. What we explained here, firstly, is that nationalism just obstructs the activities in Scouts. That is to say, you spend a lot of time wasted in Scouts. Even if you don't believe it is much, comparatively, you're obviously going to spend more time on Scout activities than not. But secondly, that means even when you had that skill acquisition, I think there's an example, when you learn how to tie a rope, you also talk to another person. That meant that when you were learning these activities, it was just more inefficient than otherwise. But then the impacting of this inclusion is you obviously just had less Scouts, you had a more niche group, and that just meant you had less capacity for Scouts, you had the impact globally. And finally, as I said in my introduction here, nationalism is integrated into the culture of the Scouts code. That is, instead of you have less emphasis on things like integrity, on honesty, on perseverance, that meant, and it specifically is in tension with nationalism, which is obviously very ethnocentric and inherently others people. What that meant was, when you were othering your own nation over other nations, you were going to be, no thank you, you weren't going to be integrating as much with other nations. This was obviously going to be very hard. What was the impact that had for community? I think we have three things here. Firstly, say you were the Australian Scouts group, you will not integrate or you will not work with the New Zealand Scout group because you are obviously propping up your own nationalism. This meant you weren't cooperating with other nations. This was a harm. But secondly, and I think more importantly here, it meant that you would prioritize your domestic national goals over your international goals. The impacting here is that most of these Scouts are in developed nations. Obviously Ghana probably doesn't have Girl Scouts, but somewhere like America and Australia does. And this looked like maybe fundraising, going over there to help build houses or provide food. This obviously had a the marginal benefit you got here was better because obviously, say $100 million was spent in Australia. The benefit that had to people's lives was a lot less than what $100 million in a developing nation. That had the most amount, I won't keep taking any more POIs. This had the most amount of benefit to a very large degree. And I think this was a very this is also not speculative because you don't have this nationalistic thing where you only prioritize Australian needs or New Zealand needs. And finally, even if you didn't buy that you're going to help each other domestically, thirdly, just having more people means you can help the Scouts domestically. And firstly, just because you had more quantitatively manpower, and secondly, because I explained, because you're not clouded by things like learning about the history, which is probably poorly done, you learn more efficiently, right? When I say poorly done, I mean in a way that's damaging to people's understanding of race and identity. So that's our second extension, and I think it clearly is the most tangible in how it actually impacts, and is the most important contribution because it has the most impact. But finally, it is just to say that Scouts is just an inherently good thing. I think That is to say, firstly, it helps troubled kids who just don't have any other community outside of that. This at least gives them something to do. But secondly, there are obviously a litany of other good things, like life skills, how to camp, how to tie a knot, how to survive in the wilderness. Secondly, mentorship, physical benefits, leadership opportunity. Remember, we claim these benefits because we show more people will actually be engaged in it, and engaged in a way that's positive. What do we think at the end of this debate? We tell you, firstly, that we actually provide the way in which you get more people in. We provide benefit to the most amount of people in developing nations and domestically, and we also provide help to the members in the Scouts. For those reasons, please side with
Thank the government member. I'd like to welcome the opposition member.
Politicians in Western countries around the world say things like no Australian child should be left behind, that all Australians are entitled to certain human rights, that no American should live on the street. Those statements only have meaning and connect with people because there is an idea of something, being an Australian, being an American, but not just being an arbitrary person who resides within the borders of those countries, but being a collective member of a group. Even though these people who you might never lived with before, might never see, who live in different states, who come from different races, different classes, the idea that they share something with you is what nationalism is. Nationalism is good, and that will be the extension of the closing opposition. But first, let me wade into the opening half. The opening half was very much concerned with about how militaristic and how how much bad history and things is going to be taught within the scouting organisation. We think that the missing piece of the opening half is the following. That it's not about how much Scouts is like cadets, it's that Scouts and cadets coexist and compete for the same demographic of parents and children, parents who want a free activity which has a kind of an outdoorsy, bushcrafty feel and has some sort of, educational benefit. And what we think is that Scouts removing nationalism from its selling point will actually drive those people to cadets, where you will magnify and intensify all of the problems that OG was concerned with. Because, for example, any family who has a veteran in it will likely feel betrayed by this move away from national identity. Any parents who, for example, are Republicans or Liberal Party members will probably feel betrayed by this move away from nationalism, and they will sign their kids up for cadets instead. We also think that they're likely to lose a lot of advertisers. For example, most of these things are run by volunteers or also by local council grants and stuff like that. And the kind of yip nationalism local councillor will now more likely to approve the cadet funding and cadet advertising grant and stuff and give that airtime rather than the Scouts one. So for all of the reasons we share with OGs why we don't like the militarism of cadets, it's overly disciplinary and a drive towards the military, you actually get more of that when Scouts stops competing with that demographic of clients. And that's why we don't think we should give up on them, why we should instead draw them into the far more placid and far more community-orientated version of that kind of thing, which is Scouts. Second question in this debate is evaluating who we should be impacting. Government really wants you to think about new recruits, okay? They want you to think about the positive impacts you could be having on new people who would join but won't currently because of nationalism. What we say is that they've actually misidentified why these people don't join. And so, sadly, as much as I teach a lot of these families, new immigrants' families don't not join Scouts because it's too nationalistic. They just don't like the idea of their kids spending the night in anywhere other than a family home. These are the types of people where schools are having trouble getting these kids to attend school camps, right? There's not anything to do with nationalism whatsoever. It's that a lot of these families just don't like the idea of camping. They find it to be weird, why are we living in the lucky country just to be going outdoors and roughing it? They have very conservative ideas about who, no one's going to take care of my child except for me and my family, and they don't like the idea of, for example, boys and girls mixing overnight, right? So this is what is driving people away from Scouts. It's got absolutely nothing to do with nationalism. So you're just not going to get these new recruits because you don't understand why they're not joining Scouts. It's got nothing to do with nationalism whatsoever. However, what we do say in this debate is the people we should be focusing on in terms of impact is the existing large client base of people who already do Scouts. Because what is the biggest predictor of a child doing Scouts? It's that their parent did Scouts, right? These are the people who will always keep on joining regardless of whether we've got the nationalism or not, or, you'll get less of them, but they are still going to be the lion's share of Scouts recruits. So where you're going to have the biggest impact is on the way in which Scouts values affects these people, not on the tiny amount of new people who you're not going to recruit on their side of the house. And you know, like, this is why Arin's response to my PY is so telling, because he talks about women in tech. Like, a great example, guys, because despite the fact that we have all these advertising drives, when you rock up to Hope Theatre and do Engineering 101, there's still only 3 women in there. You know what I mean? Like, it goes to show that there are other factors which just can't be solved by advertising and values. Okay, now on to the main plank of our extension is why nationalism is good, but first I'll take that.
Sure. So this is a good case as to why immigrant parents would become scoutmasters so they could be there with their kids. They do not do that when you have to pledge allegiance to a foreign flag and pray to a foreign god.
No, I mean, you just don't understand, unfortunately. They just, for example, they don't like the idea of sleeping outside because they think that why did we flee our country and come to the lucky country just to sleep outside again? Like, it sounds weird, but I've heard parents say this. Or the idea that there are boys and girls in the same area overnight, or that they are sleeping outside the family home. Like, these are people who aren't allowed to go to sleepover birthday parties. They're not going to be allowed to go to scouts no matter what. Okay, this is why we think that nationalism is the best inclusive narrative. Because unlike other narratives, like unifying narratives like religion, like race, like ethnicity, nationalism is open to all. All you need to do is live here, right? Be willing to, for example, sing the national anthem, like, you know, salute a flag, enjoy a sports game, and you don't have to enjoy all of them, you just have to enjoy one of them. Or, you know, like, be notionally interested in throwing a sausage on a barbecue, you know what I mean? Like, it's very easy to adopt one of the many options you have that signify you're an Australian. It's not ethnically tied, like closing wants to believe. Otherwise, why would people like Cathy Freeman and Nova Paris Kneebone be considered national treasures? How could Rishi Sunak or Barack Obama ascend to be the literal heads of states, an extremely nationalistic title, despite the fact that they come from immigrant families and are of other races? What nationalism does is provide everyone an on-ramp to be part of the in-group, because all you need to do is live here. Arin might say it's foolish because you didn't choose it, but that's exactly why it's a good thing, because you don't have to choose it, because you don't have to actually, you don't have to genuinely adopt that many values. You just need to give off one of about 1 billion signifiers. It's not judgmental like that. Okay, what we think is that Scouts channels these nationalism into extremely productive activities. Things like volunteering at soup kitchens, cleaning up at your local parks, volunteering at retirement homes, learning about organisations like the Rural Fire Service, doing fundraising, lemonade stands and things like that. OG's idea that Scouts is all about teaching colonialism. Like, here's a few reasons to believe this is not true. 1, it would become a huge media scandal. 2, your clientele is like 8 to 14-year-olds. Like, they just don't have that much patience for like doing more school. They want to be outside having fun. Their parents don't want to send them to bush camp so they can do more school. That, like, there are so many hours in the day to fill up. There just can't be that many. But even if it was true, they learn so much productive narratives at school anyway that we think, like, Uncle Bob's slightly insensitive rant is likely to be undone by the hours and hours of tests they have to do in school to learn about how to do it properly. Okay, so really, guys, at the end of the day, we think that lastly, these experiences are going to be more formative to their unifying values than the explicit lessons are. Because what kids remember is the things they do, not the things they're told. And the things they do when they engage in Scouts is care for community. Learn about the value of caring for old people, caring for people who are other than yourselves, raising funds not for yourself but for other people. And we think these experiences impart the values which make them value things like welfare and caring for others in the long run. And that's why we're proud to propose.
I thank the opposition member. I'd like to welcome the government whip.
It's newer I have lived in. I'm going to begin this speech, firstly, with our unresponded to extension about how this increases the efficiency of the resources that Scouts can provide to the world. So this extension is to say that nationalism makes you likely to favour your nation and your domestic interests. What this means then is that when you're selecting the things you're going to focus on, when you're deciding the charities you're going to donate to, you're more likely to focus on one that is domestic. And the reason this is important in this debate is because Scouts is highly likely to exist in developed nations, because those are the people that have the funds to support this, those are the people who are most likely to have the volunteers that can do this. They're the ones that are most likely to have resources to do something superfluous like Scouts. And for that reason, they're the places where this occurs, where Scouts exist in developed nations. So focusing on their domestic interests is just much less efficient than if they were to focus internationally. And we see that when in the absence of nationalism, you're more likely to care about international interests. You're more likely to focus your resources on things that actually matter much more, and to places where your resources can just stretch much further. And what this means then is that Scouts is more likely then to donate to developed nations and to do things like that when they're doing fundraisers to focus on things like that. And this went completely unresponded to by our opposing opposition team. And we think this is independent of the opening clash on whether or not you get more engagement overall, because it explains why independent of if engagement stays roughly the same as you might think it's a wash, this explains why the resources that you have will be more efficiently used on our side than it would be used on the opposition side. So that explains our extension and why it clearly wins the debate. But now onto the other things in this debate. Firstly now on engagement and whether or not we increase engagement. The first thing we tell you is that we overall increase inclusivity. Now, OG never actually explains why nationalism itself is tied to race. They only explain why the implications and the impacts of nationalism on the Scout process, that things like having history and that things like religion would necessarily restrict people. But we explain why nationalism itself restricts access. And this is for the reason that nationalism is just led by the majority, which means it is likely to exclude racial minorities. It is formed early in a nation's creation, when racism is far more likely to be widespread. For the reasons that it exists in conservative spaces, it is likely to then maintain the remnants of that sort of racism from the nation's start. And furthermore, it requires the existence of clear in-groups and out-groups. And to divide in-groups and out-groups clearly, you need clear dividing lines. Something like, oh, you're Australian is not clear enough for a large majority of people. So what you end up doing is drawing it along racial lines. This is obviously not okay, and obviously there are examples like close opposition wants to talk about Cathy Freeman, but I reckon there are thousands more examples of Aboriginal people who have been told that they're not Australian, or people who are from different nations, or migrants or immigrants who have been told that they just aren't Australian. All of those people stand to say that nationalism, in the large majority of cases, is directly tied to the race of individuals. What this means then is that it directly locks out people from engaging with Scouts when Scouts itself is tied to this nationalism. But then, as well as this, we give you two other independent reasons for why we overall increase engagement. This is firstly for the reason that people view Scouts as being more useful now, because it doesn't involve superfluous things like going to a random ANZAC march, particularly noting people might just not care about this because they are from different backgrounds. But then thirdly, we explain to you that parents can just be opposed to nationalistic things for political reasons. They might just be opposed to militaristic ideas and things like the ANZAC, and therefore they wouldn't send their kids to the Scouts for this reason. And these two reasons explain why, independently of whether or not you believe nationalism is going to be a driving factor of pushing people out, nationalism is going to push out diverse and minority groups. This explains why, independently of whether or not you're a minority, there are a group of people who are locked out and pushed out of Scouts due to the existence of nationalism within it. Now, opposing opposition claims that this isn't true, it's just because these people sort of want to keep their kids at home or whatever. Obviously, this is an extraordinarily narrow understanding of what Scouts is. It isn't just fucking camping every single time you go to Scouts. There are a variety of other things you do. You can just learn about the outdoors independently of being in them. You can do things like charity work. You can do things like run fundraisers. All of these are independent of whether or not you want your kids to stay at fucking home or you don't want your kids to go camping. That doesn't make sense as a response to this point. So, the impact of this point overall of this extension is to say that we simply increase the amount of benefits that Scouts can achieve. Both sides, I think, roughly agree at this point that Scouts is a good thing and it benefits the people within it. And we explain why when we get more people into Scouts and we maximize that benefit, we increase the overall benefit within this debate. Clearly another point that is able to win us in this debate. So now that explains our two main pushes in this debate and our two main extensions to win us. So now on closing opposition. Their main push here is to say that nationalism is good. Nationalism is good. You know, you've got to care about your fellow American or Australian or whatever. But obviously, you're able to learn things like service and caring about other people in other ways. Like, I care about the people in my life and the people in my community for other reasons than they're Australian, such as the fact that they're humans or the fact that I know them quite well. So, obviously, there are ways to engage with your community that don't rely on you having this nationalism. But as well as this, we just explained to you that you are more likely to care, like, we don't necessarily see that caring about your direct national community is more important than caring about other people. Obviously, caring about international communities is also just far more impactful. As I explained to you before, caring about, like, international groups and caring about, like, developing nations is probably more important and a more useful thing than caring about your own domestic people. So that takes out that extension. On that note about how people will never leave Scouts, will leave Scouts now and go to cadets and things like that. Obviously, cadets is far less widespread than Scouts for the reason that it is more costly, it requires more materials. This is something that requires you to have like funds and shit like that. Like, it is just more costly, it's less likely to be widespread than Scouts, which just requires you to have like a fucking tent, I guess. And then, as well as this, you often go to Scouts to avoid the hyper-nationalistic tendencies of cadets. So the reason, like the explanation is to say that the opposition's claim is that you really want to go to cadets, you go to Scouts instead. But obviously the reality is people don't want to go to cadets and they go to Scouts and they have to accept the fact that Scouts has this sort of nationalism. I'll take the POI from it.
Yeah, so the thing is, Scouts will never do volunteerism, and we uniquely explain to you that Scouts is the only unity mechanism to access nationalism for a lot of people.
Wait, so it's the only way to enter into the in-group?
Yeah.
Well, obviously, like, there are various ways you can enter into the in-group, but we also just don't believe that, like, this relies on the premise that you do end up engaging with Scouts, which we explained to you are unlikely to do. And as well as this, in terms of the, like, volunteering and stuff, would you just think it is illegal that lots of people, like, this would be something they would be willing to do? Like, they've done it before, they would just do it in a far greater extent than they do currently. Furthermore, in terms of closing opposition, they talk about why who go to Scouts instead of cadets, but obviously this is just to say that people would prefer Scouts, and the reason they go to Scouts is not because of the nationalism, but it is in spite of that nationalism existing there. So that takes out closing opposition. In terms of opening opposition, we explained firstly why nationalism is always bad in terms of the fact that it is directly tied to race, which takes out their material about why nationalism is good. But secondly, we outweigh this with our benefits in terms of we get greater impact of Scouts, both in terms of efficiency, in terms of the division of resources, but also in terms of having more people within Scouts itself. For those reasons, we're excited.
Thank you, Opposition Whip. I'd like to welcome the Government Whip. I'd like to welcome the Opposition Whip to close the debate.
The simplest reason why we win this debate at CO is because up till this point in the debate, no team engages in what the actual likely counterfactual is. They don't engage on two axes. Firstly, what do these families actually do? We provide the answer that they're more likely to join cadets in the alternative. And secondly, what is the identity that the Scouts adopt instead? Because what teams on opening half identify is that things like cultural values are very important in organizations and are very inevitable. And Government Whip explains that people have incentives to cater for their community anyway because they care about them. That is the point. People are inherently tribalistic and want reasons to care about people. Under the counterfactual world, in, for example, the fact that Scouts are regionally located and you have units, for example, in a high SES neighborhood or you have like a unit in a white neighborhood, people would just coalesce around those identities that are far more exclusive compared to the idea of nationalism, which we explain maybe is slightly less inclusive than like internationalism. Good luck on persuading people on that, but is obviously something that is far more inclusive because we explain that the barrier to opt into nationalism is far, far lower for the average person. So, given that, let's firstly deal with closing government. They have two extensions. Firstly is the idea that they get more engagement. First mechanism is that nationalism is specifically tied to race. This is something that is not really explained, countered by the idea we explain that people are inherently tribalistic, so these notions become far greater when instead of nationalism you connect to the fact that everyone in the North Shore, for example, is white and all the people in your scouting unit are white and that's the people that you care about. But also, I just want to tackle this broader theme from government bench as a whole, that like, immigrants can't be nationalistic? Like, of course immigrants can be proud of their country. Like, the Australian flag is not a foreign flag to me. The Australian country is not a foreign country to me. This is obviously something I can care about and something that I can access. And as Hewitt explained, the barrier to access this is quite superficial and small. Of course I can enjoy a sausage on a barbie, and I will be doing so tonight. The second mechanism that CG provides is that there's no utility from nationalistic actions like watching a flag raise, which means parents are turned off by this, and that will reduce engagement. Firstly, this is in tension with OG's mechanism, which is that the reason why nationalism is bad is presumably that these parents care so much about these activities that would spend time volunteering for this. The second thing to say is that we would argue that this is not really a big focus, if not made obvious by OO's arguments, that like flag raising and stuff is a very small part of the curriculum of scouting. You spend most of the time doing practical activities. And lastly, we'd argue that if anything, parents see this nationalism as a value add because of the fact that nationalism brings associated prestige, which is to say that the reason why people do it for things like Duke of Ed or to add on their CV is because the community perceives that Scouts is a service to the country and therefore see it as something that is important, and that's why parents by extension think it's important. Second extension is on global engagement. Firstly, this is very hard to do because this is a volunteer-run free organization. You can't really like send Scouts to Australia, New Zealand like championship type scout like tournaments. You can't really get people to go to developing countries to build buildings. You can't really fund them. Secondly, you don't really have an impact because the main the main workers under your side are like 8 to 14-year-olds. So maybe they can fundraise a bit, but they're not really gonna like change like global hunger. But lastly, to the degree at which they can do this, which is like say for example they fundraise money for African children. Like this is great and all that, but this is something that is highly uninteractive and likely to turn people off because they can't actually see those African children and connect with them. The kinds of activities that we engage with on this outside, such as helping elderly people from your local retirement home crossing the street, or going to Easters and running a barbecue there and seeing debaters are really happy, are the kinds of things that validate people's experiences and fulfill their sense of identity, is inherently cathartic. Now let's move on to whipping our extension. We provide two extensions in this debate. Firstly, we situate cadets as an existing alternative that gets more powerful and pernicious in the counterfactual. This has two important debate-winning implications. Firstly, it's structural, like, OO just asserts that Scouts is like not toxic and cool, and then says like cadets is otherwise. But this structurally explains why Scouts can't be as militaristic or zealously nationalistic as OG claims. For the reason, and this is something GovWhip even concedes, which is that Scouts needs to distinguish itself from cadets to attract members to its order, which means that it is less likely to be militaristic in the kinds of ways that OG explains. But secondly, this argument co-opts OG's entire set of harms, because all their analysis about like over-nationalism being bad, or really zealous learning about conflict is bad, is far more worse in a world where Scouts is less appealing to this group of people who want nationalism, so they join cadets instead. And it's like an end where cadets becomes more appealing because Scouts gets defunded and gets less volunteer support because of all those parents that would have volunteered under your side, which means they all move to cadets, and all those things about like learning about wars and how Australia is the best country in the world and how killing people is okay are harms that amplify. The second extension we then explain is a far more extensive mechanization and impacting of the value of nationalism. Because OO is just like, well, we think nationalism is done well, and they provide like some half mechanisms. We explain why inclusivity is intrinsic to the value of nationalism, because it is the thing that has the lowest barrier to entry. And this responds to the arbitrariness principle of OG very well, because it is the fact that being born is being arbitrary makes it a very low barrier to access, versus it's very hard to become rich, and it's virtually impossible to become black or white. The second thing to say is that nationalism is channeled through practical activity, and this is a more concrete explanation than our opening of why this is good and leads to things like community service and volunteering, because people experiencing nationalism through action is the thing that makes them more altruistic, more caring, and develops them into better people in the future. OG.
Yeah, not every country practices sausage nationalism as you guys do. This is clearly not true of the vast majority of countries.
So the problem is your closing government explains structurally that this is only about developed countries that are often quite multicultural for the reason that they're the ones that have the funds to be able to run these Scouts programs, and therefore their barriers to nationalism are usually quite broad and vague, things like the American dream. Lastly, I just want to defend against the CG claim that cadets is not an alternative because it's not developed. Cadets is highly accessible. There's like a unit in like almost like every council. There's a lot of school units. It's a free activity and it's highly funded by the military because they want to use it as a pipeline to incentivize people to join. But even if it's untrue, it's not comparative, because our claim is that in our world, cadets becomes a more powerful and bigger organization for the reasons that we explained. Lastly, on opening government. In terms of OG, I think Hewitt's largely dealt with the stuff about inclusivity. I think a marginal impact at the end of the day is quite unclear. We'd rather focus on the development of these people. But also we explain a set of reasons as to why these kind of diversity problems become worse when people attach other forms of tribalistic identity associations rather than nationalism. And lastly, the idea that nationalism is harmful. I already rebutted the stuff about arbitrariness, but in terms of stuff like state control over behavior, I just think this is a largely unrealistic claim. Like, I don't think there's a large correlation between the extent of global conflict and the amount of people who join Scouts. And since we're only talking about developed countries anyway, I think nationalism is a value-neutral thing, and it's largely determined by democratic values anyway, so it's unlikely that people are getting brainwashed in ways that are pernicious. For these reasons, very different.
Thank the opposition whip.